Hello and welcome to a fireside chat with a returning guest here, John Feldman, partner and head of shareholder activism practice at Goodmans LLP. I'm Jarrett Banks, editor at large here at CorpGov. John, welcome back to the program.
Thanks, Jared. Great to be back.
Well, John, let's get right into it. You were an advisor to a proxy battle against Gildan Activewear, a Canadian clothing maker. Before we get into the details of the victory, can you tell us a little bit about Gildan and the effort to reinstate its longstanding CEO?
Sure. This is a fight unlike any one that I'd ever been involved in before. The way this whole thing got started was in early December of last year. The company made an announcement that longtime founder and CEO Glenn Chamandy had been terminated. And when that happened, it took Glenn by surprise and it took shareholders by surprise. And shareholders didn't understand, in general, the shareholder base didn't understand why this had happened because many of those shareholders were in the stock in large part because of Glenn and because of his long-term stellar performance. So when he was sort of all of a sudden terminated, people were scratching their heads and trying to figure out why. So it all started with a bit of a thump, and then 6 months of interesting activity ensued, I would say.
Now, of course, the big news was activist investors Browning West's victory, as you pointed out. Can you
Yep.
explain what happened and what it means to sweep a board?
Sure. So just to maybe go back a little bit, so just to sort of go back into a little bit of the history. So when this was announced in December, um, Browning West immediately, who had really had no real prior relationship with Glenn, other than being a regular investor, a diligent owner of company stock, but didn't even have Glenn's personal details. But immediately they said, like, this is just wrong. We need to fix this. So right off the bat, Browning West wrote a public letter basically saying this is a disaster. We need to reinstate Glenn. We need to change the chair. And frankly, we probably need to change the board. And one of the incredibly unique circumstances that arose in the wake of that initial letter was that other shareholders did the same thing. And I've been spending decades doing proxy fights, and you dream of a situation when you're on the activist side that you can find a shareholder that will actually come and support your campaign publicly because it validates everything that you're saying. In this particular instance, it was either 8 or 9 other shareholders that did it publicly through letters, through public statements, which before this thing even began was up to 35% of the shareholders. And so it was very, very clear that what the board had done was just done without any consultation with shareholders because shareholders went apoplectic because they saw no reason to do this. The board engaged in a pretty flawed succession process, putting someone in charge that really had no business being there. I mean, I almost felt bad for the guy because he was put in a position where he was destined to fail. But the board dug in. And very early on, we had said to them, look, like this makes no sense. And we were told by their advisors, there are red lines. Vince has to stay, Glenn can't come back, and we can only give you a few board seats. To which we said, middle finger, no thank you, and requisitioned a meeting. And we said, this has to move fast. This has to move fast because every minute that Vince isn't there is potential money losing for all of the shareholders. And we got the old expression of when you dig yourself in a hole and you want to get out of it, the first thing you should do is stop digging. Unfortunately, rather than stopping digging, they dug even more. So we requisitioned a meeting to hold the meeting like as soon as possible, and the board started playing games. They first told us the requisition was invalid. We basically told them we reject your rejection, and if you don't call the meeting, we're going to call the meeting. So then they did call the meeting, and we asked them to do it right away. They said we're going to do it at the end of May. So we knew we were in for a fight because this board was digging in, both substantively and tactically. And as this fight went on, they kept on throwing stuff at Browning West. And I got to say, Browning West is one of the most, has the most integrity, great conviction, and belief in their views, because every time something was thrown at them, they made some claim that they were in violation of the HSR Act, complete BS. They made a claim that they were in violation of proxy solicitation rules, complete BS. And in fact, in both those cases, we went to court and in front of a tribunal, and we won because the court and the tribunal said both those claims were nonsense. They also tried to say that we were acting illegally with these other shareholders as a group, also nonsense. So I just kept telling these guys, they're going to throw stuff at us. It's just their typical, weak defensive playbook. Have your convictions, stick with your plan, step over this stuff, and we'll get there. And they tried to sell the company, failed. They tried to do a refreshment, failed. They were literally doing everything they could other than actually listening to shareholders. So when it got to the place where there was there was time for like third parties to make a determination, for example, like ISS, Glass Lewis, Egan-Jones, each and every one of them said, we got to get rid of this entire board and just put on Browning West slate, get Glenn back in as CEO and put Michael Nealand on as chair. And it was unequivocal. And ultimately they surrendered, long before the meeting because they knew they were going to lose. But I think like 85% of the shareholders, which I've never seen before, would have voted in favor of like throwing out the bad board and putting out the new one. It was exceptional. It was absolutely like nothing I'd ever seen before.
In your mind, why was this fight a landmark?
Well, it was a landmark for a couple of reasons. I think, I have never seen a situation. I mean, so in this situation, so a typical activist tactic is in the middle of a proxy, sorry, my apologies, a board entrenchment tactic is where, like the activist is going after certain directors, and the board, to sort of mess things up, switches it up midstream. So I wanted to go after you, Jared, and then the board says Jared's coming off and putting on John. So now as the shareholder, like, who am I going after? And, it is a tactic that it can work if done right. But so just to stop for a second. So the meeting was going to be on May 28th. On May 1st, all of the board that was responsible for this disaster basically stepped down or said they weren't going to run. And so we said, okay, good. So we basically replaced the board. And you would have thought at that point they would say, okay, we got there. So, we're going to do this. But no, what they did instead is they put on 5 new people that came out hot. Like the person that's the new guy's chair immediately attacked shareholders, and they basically blew an opportunity. They could have, said, you know what, we're the new board. We weren't part of this, disaster that happened in December. Let's be constructive. Let's figure out a way forward. But instead, they went on the attack immediately. So whoever was advising them on the PR side, I think, made a huge tactical error. And so the reason why it was so crazy, such a landmark, is, I mean, we effectively replaced almost 20 directors in like 2 months, which I've never seen happen before. We got rid of the original 5 plus the 2, and then their new slate was all gone. And it was universally sort of supported by all of the proxy advisory firms. And, it was such a resounding victory by Browning West. Usually, the ISSs of the world will say, well, we'll take some of them and take some of them, and we'll sort of see if, like, we can make harmony, some alchemy with a combination of, the existing board and the new board. But in this case, I think other than like maybe Darden with Starboard success, it just doesn't happen because everyone's always trying to find a middle ground. Most of these proxy battles often settle. There's usually some way in the middle. But in this case, it was kind of a binary choice. Like either you wanted to see a company run by Glenn Chamandy, or you wanted a company run by the person they put in. And so there was really no way to kind of have a compromise. And that was one of the reasons why Browning West decided to go for a majority, because they knew that if they didn't, because originally they were only going to put forward 5, but they realized that if they had 5 and they didn't have a majority, there was a risk that they wouldn't have the power within the board to fire the CEO and put in a new one. So it was a risk. It was a calculated risk on their part, but they, like I said, they had the conviction of what it was they wanted to do. I mean, at the end of the day, it's a significant investment for Browning West, and they wanted to protect their investment. And they didn't believe that who the board had put in was the right steward for their investment. So they went all in, and it was risky. But it was risky, but it wasn't reckless because they'd done their homework. They'd spoken with a bunch of shareholders, and they had been in touch with them sort of throughout the process very effectively. So they knew at all times, every time some tactic came out by the board, they continued their conversations with their fellow shareholders to make sure that the support was still there. They were outstanding at staying in touch with the shareholders, something that the board should have been doing as well, because you need to read the room. And I think that, had Browning West been given a different message by shareholders that, maybe we should let them have a try, maybe they would have taken a different approach. But as a result of, their outstanding outreach and communication with their fellow shareholders, they felt that they, although it was a risk that was calculated and one that, they thought worth taking because of what it meant for the future of the company.
You mentioned Darden, which happened about 10 years ago. I think that's about the last time in my mind that something like this happened. Why is it so rare for a board to lose so dramatically?
Well, I think, there's the people that are involved in this space will always tell everybody that most of these settle. And so, a lot of times there is always a way for compromise. A lot of times, shareholders will put forward a slate. They know they're not going to get them all elected, but they have an objective. But it doesn't require a situation that requires full board control. The hiring and firing of a CEO requires full board control. And so where you can have, where you get into a fight, and there's nasty fights that ultimately settle. Where you can have an arrangement that sort of works with a combination where there's some agreements to be made. In most instances, that's doable. But like I said, in this one, it was binary. You were either going through door number one or door number two, and there was no ability to compromise on that, and there was no willingness on the part of the board to compromise on that. And so, as a result of that, they took it to the end. I had one a few years ago. It was called Detour Gold, where we represented Paulson Company, and the same thing happened. That went on for about 9 months, and it was about the future direction of the company, and there were some issues with the current CEO, and same kind of thing. It was just there were attempts to settle. There's always an attempts to settle. There were attempts to settle in Gildan as well, but at the end of the day, you couldn't split the baby here. There was no Solomon's baby type of solution that was going to work. And so people were just dug in. And, if I was representing the board, I think I would have done it differently. I think I would have said, maybe we should do this. We should settle because it's not looking good. But I don't know what they were thinking. I don't know what the mindset was. I guess they had their own sort of bright lines and conviction that they felt they wanted to fall behind, but they were kind of living in a vacuum because they weren't listening. They weren't reading the room. They weren't listening to what shareholders were saying. I guess they didn't believe it. Maybe they were willfully blind. I don't know why, but sometimes you have to look at things and you have to sort of say to yourself, it's just at some point we stop fighting, which they did the Thursday before the Tuesday, but that was basically 6 months later. And frankly, this could have been done in January instead of being the most expensive proxy fight in, not just Canadian history, but in history. I think the board spent more money on this fight than Disney did earlier this year. And for what? It was silly for an outcome that, we knew we were gonna get there in December.
More than Disney. That's an incredible stat there.
It's unbelievable. I mean, it's an $8 billion company, but it's not Disney.
Do you think this will have implications for other activist situations, both in Canada and the US? Do you think companies will be more willing to settle after having seen such an embarrassing loss?
Well, I think they'll be more willing to settle with Browning West. That's for sure. I think Browning West, like Starboard, is now going to be a name that when their name sort of comes to a board, the board's going to understand that these guys mean business. And Browning West showed in this fight that, like I said before, if they have a conviction and an idea that they believe is the right thing for their investment, I mean, they have LPs, they need to protect data, they need to deliver returns to their LPs, they're going to follow through. And I think it depends on the activist. A lot of times, a lot of times what boards will do, and I represent boards and I represent activists, this is what we do in Canada. A lot of times boards will, use the tactics that, the Gildan board did in an effort to try to test the resolve of the activist and to see, like, are they prepared to go to court? Are they prepared to go in front of a regulator? Are they prepared to spend the money, spend the time, the PR, risk, like having their names dragged through the mud, or do they just want this to end quietly? And so I think, to answer your question, I think, like all lawyers do, I will answer that with the classic, it depends. It depends because it depends who the activist is. It depends what the issue is. And it depends, how, what I do say is I think the one lesson that I think the boards will have to learn from this one, which I thought every board knew already, is you really need to speak to your shareholders, and you need to understand, where they stand. Because at the end of the day, a board does have the right to hire and fire a CEO, but shareholders have the right to hire and fire the board. And so they need to understand that better. So maybe it's going back in future fights, sort of to say, like, we need to really understand what our shareholders are thinking, and then make a decision as to what strategy and tactics we're going to employ, and how far we're going to take this, and where we're prepared to settle, what we're not prepared to settle on, but at least with a better understanding of where the shareholder base is sitting, because otherwise, it's going to be another sweep. I mean, it doesn't happen very often because most people read the room. I just don't know what they were doing. I got to be honest.
What will this mean for cross-border activism? Do you think more Americans will look north for targets?
I hope so. Canada has always been a shareholder activist, a shareholder-friendly environment. And we've talked about this before. There are inherent rights for shareholders baked into the corporate law. One that we always talk about is you own 5%, you can requisition a meeting. Over time, there have been tactics that have been employed by boards to make it difficult for shareholders to exercise their rights. One of those tactics, for example, is using the court system to sue to sue shareholders falsely, usually, for acting as a group. We call it acting jointly and in concert. And lately, courts and securities regulators have been looking at this, and they've been shutting it down because they've been saying it's just complete BS. So that's a tactic. Sorry, my lights just turned off. I'll move so it gets back on. Sorry. There we go. That's sorry about that. But so what I would say is, structurally, Canada is very shareholder friendly. Tactically, there has been a pendulum swinging, sort of giving boards the ability and some leeway to mitigate those rights. But I think over the last year or so, whether it was AMIA, whether it was Northwest Copper, and now especially with Gildan, I think the pendulum is now swinging more again to sort of shareholder rights. And so I think that where there are interesting targets, I think I've been getting a ton of calls since Gildan about cross-border opportunities, and and there aren't that many sort of activist investors in Canada. A lot of them are US based that come to Canada, and so people are kicking a lot of tires right now and trying to get smart on some of these companies. But I do think Browning West did a really great job in sort of opening the door or reopening the door for other non-Canadian shareholders to look at potential campaigns where they think they could be successful. So I think it's going to happen. What's interesting, though, is that we're heading towards the end of AGM season, proxy season. So usually the summer, there's a bit of a break, and then we get into the fall, into what I refer to as requisition season, where shareholders, they accumulate a 5% position and then requisition special meetings early enough so that the company doesn't try to blend it into the AGM, which is exactly what Gildan did this year. They took the requisition meeting, said, we'll just have the AGM instead in May. So I do think there's going to be a lot more. I mean, a lot of people kick tires, and people actually, more metaphors, and people actually pull the trigger. That's a different story, but there is a huge level of interest, more than I've seen in years, in Canadian activism. I don't see that stopping anytime soon.
All right, we'll leave it there. My thanks to Jonathan Feldman, partner and head of shareholder activism practice at Goodmans LLP. I'm Jarrett Banks signing off here at CorpGov.